She was pale, fragile, her body seconds away from being sealed inside the cold chamber of a funeral home. Yet, against every grim signature on the death certificate, her chest still rose with the faintest breath. It wasn't a doctor or a grieving relative who caught it. It was the trembling voice of an 8-year-old girl dialing 911, and that call set everything in motion. A loyal German shepherd named Rex, and a weary but relentless police officer, Luke Matz, would soon race against time, uncovering a scheme so cruel it could hollow out the soul. But what happened in Cedar Falls that winter morning wasn't just survival. It was defiance. It was faith. It was the bond between a daughter and her mother refusing to be buried beneath lies. Cedar Falls, Montana. A town often hidden under blankets of fog, its winters heavy with silence. That morning, though, the mist felt different, thicker, as if the sky itself was trying to smother the streets. Houses with frosted windows stood like watchful ghosts, while the echo of a distant church bell clashed with the crunch of ice underfoot. Inside a 2-story house with peeling green shutters, little Lily Bennett gripped an old landline so tightly her fingers turned bone white. "Please, please hurry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My mom is still breathing. They're taking her to the funeral home. Don't let them lock her in that cold room." Lily was slight for her age, wrapped in an oversized pink sweater, frayed at the collar. Wisps of blonde hair clung to her cheeks, damp with tears. Her wide blue eyes brimmed with both terror and resolved the eyes of a child who should have been in class coloring with crayons, not fighting to keep her mother alive with a phone call. On the other end, the dispatcher hesitated for a fraction of a second. A child's imagination? A prank? But Lily's voice pressed harder, her words tumbling over one another. "They said she died. They signed the paper. But I touched her cheek. It was warm. Please, someone has to believe me." At the Cedar Falls Police Department, Officer Luke Matz was swallowing the last bitter sip of stale coffee when the call came through. 43 years had carved lines into his square jaw, gray dusting his brown hair. The faint scar along his chin spoke of a night long ago, when violence had shown him just how merciless people could be. Yet beneath his steady voice and broad shoulders lay something deeper, a loneliness sharpened by years of grief. His wife had passed, and though he rarely spoke of it, that loss had given him 2 things: patience with children and zero tolerance for injustice. At his feet stirred his partner, Rex. 6 years old, black and tan coat shining under the dim precinct lights, ears pricking sharp at the sound of urgency. Rex was no ordinary dog. His amber eyes caught truths that words missed, his instincts drawn taut like a wire ready to snap into action. Soldier and guardian, he was Luke's shadow. The call ended, but it sparked something. Luke grabbed his coat. Rex growled low, as if he, too, understood time was bleeding out fast. What they didn't yet know was this. The woman wasn't simply a victim of misdiagnosis. She was meant to disappear. Someone wanted her silenced permanently. And by saving her, Luke and Rex weren't just rescuing a mother. They were stepping straight into a conspiracy buried deeper than the winter fog. And for Lily Bennett, that desperate phone call wasn't the end of her fear. It was the beginning of a storm that would turn her small town upside down. He bore a faint scar on his flank, the memory of a training accident, but it only deepened his aura of resilience. Rex was more than a K-9 unit to Luke. He was family, the steady rhythm to a life that often tilted toward chaos. When Luke's voice cracked slightly after his wife's death, it was Rex who curled. Against his side, silent but grounding. Together, they had formed a partnership built on loyalty, so complete it often. Felt like Rex understood every unspoken word. Northstar Funeral Home, the dispatcher repeated as she relayed the location. Luke stood instantly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. The words echoed like a warning bell in his mind. A child claiming her mother still breathed in the care of undertakers. Was not something to ignore, no matter how improbable. "Let's move, partner," Luke muttered, and Rex was already at the door before he finished the sentence. The patrol vehicle roared to life, its headlights cutting through the heavy fog. The road to Northstar Funeral Home wound past the old church and across a narrow bridge, where icicles hung like jagged teeth. Luke's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw set. Beside him, Rex pressed against the passenger seat, eyes fixed ahead as though he knew lives depended on their speed. Meanwhile, Lily stood outside the tall brick building of Northstar Funeral Home, her breath clouding in the cold air. The structure loomed with its faded sign and wrought iron gate, an unsettling place that smelled faintly of varnish and lies, even from the street. She hugged herself, small fists gripping her sleeves, watching 2 men in black coats wheel a stretcher toward the back. entrance. Her mother, Grace Bennett, lay on it, motionless, her dark hair spilling over the white sheet. Grace was 35, slender with high cheekbones, and the soft olive complexion of someone who had once enjoyed long summer afternoons, outdoors. Her beauty was quiet, understated, the kind that didn't shout but lingered, yet her face now was drained of color, lips faintly parted, chest rising so shallowly that only Lily's desperate closeness had noticed. The breath. Grace had been known in the community as warm but independent, raising Lily alone after her husband left when the child was 3. She had worked double shifts at the diner on Main Street, carrying trays with a smile. Despite exhaustion, her determination to keep a home for Lily was admired by some, envied by others. But over the past week, she had fallen suddenly ill, a mystery that baffled neighbors who had seen her healthy days before. And now, as her body disappeared into the funeral home, Lily felt as though the world had decided too quickly to write her mother's ending. Luke's vehicle screeched to a halt outside. He stepped out, his heavy boots sinking into the slush, while Rex leapt down beside him, fur bristling. The fog wrapped around them, swallowing sound, except for the faint chime of the church bell tolling another hour. "Where's the girl?" Luke asked, scanning the street. Then he saw her small, shivering, clutching the phone still in her hand. Lily's eyes widened with both fear and relief. She darted forward, nearly stumbling in the snow, and grabbed Luke's sleeve. "Please, they're putting her inside. She's not gone, I swear it. She's still breathing." Luke crouched down, so they were eye level. His expression softened, though his jaw remained tight. "You did the right thing calling, Lily. I believe you." At his words, Rex stepped closer, nudging his nose against Lily's small hand. The girl gasped, then clung to the dog's thick fur as though it were the only anchor in her storm. Rex didn't move away. Instead, he pressed firmly against her, a silent promise of protection. Inside the funeral home, the air was heavy with polish and wilting flowers. The long hallway echoed with the squeak of wheels as the stretcher was rolled toward a cold metal door at the back. 2 employees moved quickly, heads down. Luke's boot struck hard against the floor as he entered, voice sharp. "Stop right there." The men froze, startled, and Rex growled low, ears flat, hackles raised, his gaze locked on the metal door ahead, and he barked once loud, urgent, a sound that reverberated through the tiled corridor like a warning bell. Luke's instincts kicked in. He knew Rex's signals too well to doubt them. Something inside that room wasn't right. He pushed forward, hand brushing his holster, though it was authority rather than force he intended to use. One of the men stammered. "Officer, the paperwork is signed. Papwork doesn't breathe," Luke snapped. He shouldered past them, gripping the handle of the cold chamber. Rex lunged forward, claws scraping against the tile, barking fiercely at the door as though demanding it be opened. Luke pulled hard. The door creaked wide, releasing a gust of icy air that made his breath plume white. And there, beneath a thin sheet, Grace's chest rose with the faintest, most fragile rhythm. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The fog outside, the tolling bell, the startled shouts of the employees, all faded. There was only the sight of a mother clinging to life, and a child's desperate truth finally heard. Luke's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Get an ambulance now." Rex pressed closer, to the stretcher, standing guard, while Lily clutched her mother's limp hand, whispering through her tears. I told them you were still here." Outside, sirens began to wail faintly in the distance, growing louder as they pierced the fog. Luke kept his eyes locked on Grace, then on the trembling girl who had saved her. In his chest, something tightened, not despair, but the sharp weight of realization. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. His gut told him, and Rex's unyielding posture confirmed it. This was something darker, something staged, and they had just pulled back the first layer of a deadly scheme. The air inside, Northstar Funeral Home was sharp with a mingling sense of polish, Lilies, and cold steel. The lights overhead buzzed, faintly, flickering, as if unwilling to illuminate what truly lay beneath the surface. For Officer Luke Matz, it was a place that reared not only of grief, but of something deliberately hidden. At his side, Rex paced slowly, claws tapping against the tile, his body tense, head lowered, ears prick-ricked forward. The dog was no longer just alert. He was on the verge of warning. Lily Bennett clung to her mother's hand until a paramedic gently pulled her aside to check Grace's breathing. The girl's face was blotched with tears, her braid loosened and falling apart, her blue eyes red, rimmed but fixed unflinchingly on the stretcher. She looked so small against the cold brightness of the room, yet her presence felt larger than anyone else's. Her voice had brought the police here. Her insistence had forced them to open the chamber. Grace Bennett lay pale beneath the thin sheet. The shallow rise and fall of her chest was nearly imperceptible. Her lips cracked, skin cold with the beginnings of hypothermia. But there was life. Weak, fragile, almost drowned in the shadows, but life. Luke's jaw tightened, and he shot a look at the staff who had nearly sealed her fate. The first was Caleb Morton, the funeral home's manager. He was in his mid-50 seconds, tall and heavy-set, with thinning blonde hair slicked flat against his scalp. His skin was ruddy from years of drinking, and a trimmed but uneven beard shadowed his broad jawline. Caleb had the air of a man who had long ago stopped caring about appearances, carrying himself with slouched shoulders and a faint odor of whiskey masked poorly by cheap cologne. His eyes, small and watery, flickered nervously between Luke and Rex. Beneath the weight of the uniformed officer's gaze, he shifted his stance like someone used to working in gray areas where paperwork could cover anything. Beside him stood Kyle Mercer, Grace's boyfriend. Kyle was younger, about 32, lean but wiry, with a sharp face framed by dark stubble that seemed permanent. His brown hair was cropped short on the sides, longer on top, perpetually disheveled as though he never bothered with a comb. Kyle's hazel eyes held something restless, an edginess that suggested both charm and danger depending on the day. He wore a leather jacket scuffed at the elbows, jeans, faded to white at the knees, and boots that had seen more nights in bars than honest work. Kyle had been known around the town as persuasive, someone who could talk himself into or out of almost anything. But under pressure, that easy. Swagger faltered, replaced by the flicker of someone with far too much to lose. Luke's voice cut through the room, like a blade. This woman is alive. Why was she taken here without proper verification? Caleb swallowed hard, his throat working. The death certificate was signed, officer. We only followed procedure. Luke's gaze narrowed. Signed by who? Caleb fumbled with a folder, producing a sheet with shaky hands. Dr. Nolan Pierce. He's on call for cases like this. Luke scanned the page, his sharp eye caught details immediately. The signature oddly rushed, the handwriting inconsistent, and the address of the supposed physician off by several digits. It Ryer of fabrication. Nolan Pierce, Luke repeated aloud, voice laced with suspicion. Never heard of him? And I've worked Cedar Falls for 2 decades. Rex suddenly let out a bark so loud it rattled the metal cabinets along the wall. The German shepherd lunged forward, claws scraping, as he slammed against the heavy steel door that led to the refrigeration chamber. His teeth flashed as he barked. Again, pawing and scratching with such force, the sound echoed through the corridor. Lily startled, but then gasped, her small voice trembling. That's where they were taking her. Luke moved swiftly. Open it now, Caleb stammered. Officer, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. Open it, Luke repeated, low and sharp, his hand hovering near his holster. The worker nearest to the control panel hesitated, then entered. The code. The thick steel door unlatched with a hiss, swinging open to reveal the stark cold chamber within. Rex surged forward, nose pressed to the air, barking furiously as though to tear the silence apart. Inside, Grace lay on a gurney, chest still faintly rising. The icy air pulled out, washing across Luke's boots. Get her out, Luke, commanded. The paramedics moved quickly, rolling Grace out and wrapping her in heated blankets. Her pulse, though weak, fluttered against the medic's fingers. One of them, a tall woman with cropped black hair and a professional calmness, called out, "She's breathing shallow but steady. Severe hypothermia, dehydration. She needs the hospital immediately." Lily rushed to her mother's side, tears streaking her cheeks. She pressed her small hands against Grace's, whispering, "I told them, Mama. I told them you weren't gone." Luke stood tall, eyes like storm clouds as he turned back to Caleb and Kyle. "You nearly killed her, and they will explain every detail of how this happened." But even as he spoke, Caleb shifted nervously toward the side door, and Kyle's eyes darted away, calculating. The 2 men weren't as shocked as they should have been. Their reaction was too rehearsed, too prepared. Luke noticed, but he also knew Grace needed immediate evacuation. It would be time to follow their trails. The ambulance team pushed the stretcher out, Rex trailing protectively. Alongside, his head low, eyes darting between Grace and the shadows of the hallway. Outside, the wail of sirens grew closer as backup units arrived. Snowflakes drifted down, clinging to Lily's hair as she climbed into the ambulance beside her mother. Her sobs turned into hiccuping breaths as she pressed her cheek to Grace's blanket, covered arm. Luke followed them out but paused on the threshold. In the corner of his eye, he caught Caleb whispering furiously to Kyle, both men backing into the shadows of the corridor. A door creaked quietly, and by the time Luke turned, the two figures had slipped out into the mist, their footsteps swallowed by the fog rolling through the parking lot. Luke clenched his jaw, the scar on his chin tightening as his teeth ground together. He knew a cover-up when he saw one, and he knew, with Rex's sharp instincts as his compass, that this wasn't a clerical error, it was a plot. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and pulled away, its red lights glowing against the snow, Rex pressed his nose to Luke's hand, a silent confirmation of what his gut already told him. The fight to save Grace Bennett was only beginning. The storm that morning had left a crust of ice across the streets of Cedar Falls, making each car tire hiss as it rolled across the pavement. Inside the police department, the air buzzed with tension. Word of the near-death discovery at Northstar Funeral Home had spread quickly among the staff. For Luke Matz, the weight of the case pressed heavier than any blizzard could. Luke sat at a long oak table in the evidence room. The death certificate spread in front of him beneath a fluorescent lamp. The paper bore the signature of Dr. Nolan Pierce, the supposed physician who had declared Grace Bennett dead. The signature itself was rushed, almost careless. But what made Luke's jaw clench was the faint whiff of fraud that clung to every line of the document. Across from him sat Detective Caroline Grant, the department's senior investigator. Caroline was 41, with auburn hair that brushed her shoulders in loose waves, struts. She had sharp green eyes that seemed to strip away lies in a single glance. Her face was lightly freckled, her skin fair, but weathered by years spent chasing criminals under both sun and snow. Caroline was tall with a lean, angular build that carried the quiet authority of someone who had long ago stopped caring whether others underestimated her. Her colleagues respected her, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it, case after case. But beneath that hardened exterior lay scars. Caroline's younger. The brother had disappeared years earlier, under suspicious circumstances, never to be found. The unresolved grief had shaped her into an investigator who despised loose ends. She chased every thread until it snapped in her hands. Unwilling to ever let another family face the kind of silence hers had endured, she tapped her fingernail against the certificate. There is no doctor. Nolan Pierce in Montana's medical registry. I checked the database. Twice. Whoever wrote this was pretending. Luke's brow furrowed. So, Grace Bennett was nearly sealed away because of a forged doctor. Caroline nodded grimly. And that forgery doesn't exist in a vacuum. Somebody had a reason to rush her out of the picture. Rex lay stretched out beside the table, his thick black and tan coat glinting under the overhead light. His head was lifted, amber eyes watchful, though calm on the surface. His tail flicked in small, tense movements, as if he too sensed that the paper before them was a window into something far more dangerous. Luke lifted Grace's scar from the evidence bag, the soft fabric still faintly, and carrying her scent. He crouched down, holding it near Rex's nose. The dog inhaled deeply, his ears perking. Instantly, he stood, pacing, then tugged toward the door with a sharp bark. Carolyn raised a brow. He's got something. Luke grabbed his coat. Let's see where it takes us. The patrol SUV crunched across icy roads, Rex in the blues. Back, his body taut with focus, nose pressed against the crack of the window. He whined, barked, then leaned sharply toward the left, at a crossroads. Luke followed the signal, tires hissing as they turned toward the industrial outskirts of town. The trail ended at a storage warehouse complex, rows of corrugated metal units, their paint flaking under years of Montana winters. A chain-link fence sagged along one side, and the padlock on Unit 17 hung loosely as if it had been opened recently. Luke and Caroline exchanged a glance before stepping inside. Rex bounded forward, his nose darting between stacks of cardboard boxes. The smell of mold and dust clung to the air, but beneath it was something sharper. Ink, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of coins. They pried open a large box. Inside lay stacks of cash ledgers, each page crammed with names, dates, and amounts written in hurried, uneven script. Caroline flipped through them, her eyes narrowing. These are payouts, insurance, claims, or at least they're meant to look like them. Another crate revealed folders stuffed with insurance, contracts, most stamped with fake signatures and notary seals. Luke's stomach sank when he found a draft deed, transfer bearing Grace Bennett's name. Her modest house on Cedar Avenue, the one she had fought so hard to keep, had been targeted for fraud. Caroline held up one of the pages, her jaw tightening. This is bigger than Caleb Morton cutting corners. This looks like a pipeline. Fake doctors, fake paperwork, fake funerals, all funneling assets to someone else. Luke's voice was low, steady, and they nearly buried Grace alive to make sure the transfer went through. Rex barked sharply from the far corner, pawing at a black plastic bag. Luke knelt and pulled it open to reveal an assortment of smaller items, wallets, IDs, and credit cards belonging to different people, many of whom Luke recognized from unsolved missing person reports in surrounding counties. Caroline blew out a slow breath. We're staring at organized fraud, maybe worse. Back at the precinct, the evidence was logged, photographs taken, and a team assembled. But Luke knew their next step wasn't just about cataloging. It was about drawing the perpetrators back out into the open. He leaned over the table, in the strategy room, speaking to Caroline and the others. The funeral's been postponed, but they'll expect to resume once the paperwork clears. We'll make sure they think nothing has changed. Caroline folded her arms. You're thinking bait? Luke nodded. Exactly. A funeral flower arrangement is already scheduled to be delivered to Northstar. We'll wire one of the wreaths with a GPS tracker. If Caleb or Kyle comes back to handle their unfinished business, we'll follow them straight to whoever is pulling the strings. Rex, lying near the door, thumped his tail once against the floor as if in approval. The plan was set into motion. That afternoon, an officer from the logistics unit arrived carrying the large wreath of white lies and roses, its ribbon reading, "In loving memory." The flowers smelled sweet, but carried a hidden sting. Inside, beneath the petals, was a discreet GPS chip. No, larger than a fingernail. Caroline adjusted the ribbon, making sure the device was secure, but invisible. They'll never see it coming. Luke's gray eyes flicked toward the window, where snow fell in steady flakes. His expression was hard, thoughtful. They thought they could hide death in plain sight. Let's show them what happens when. The dead don't stay silent. As the wreath was loaded for delivery back to Northstar Funeral Home, Rex pressed his nose against the petals, sneezing once before settling back with an almost knowing look. Lily, sitting quietly in a corner chair with a blanket around her shoulders, watched the process with wide eyes. She still hadn't spoken much since. Her mother was taken to the hospital, but when she saw Rex wag his tail at her, she managed the faintest smile. Caroline knelt beside her. You were brave, Lily. You saved your mom. Now, we're going to make sure the people who tried to hurt her can't hurt anyone else. Lily nodded, her small hand curling into the thick fur at Rex's neck. The dog leaned into her touch, a silent promise of loyalty. Outside, the gray sky deepened as the delivery van pulled away with the wreath inside. Hidden beneath its petals, the beacon began to blink. Somewhere soon, someone would return to tie up loose ends. And, when they did, Luke, Caroline, Rex, and the entire department would be waiting. The road leading to the Owens farm stretched out beneath the cold glow of a rising moon. Snow blanketed the fields, and silver, and the skeletal branches of old cottonwood trees swayed under the crisp wind. Luke Mathers guided the SUV, carefully over the narrow lane, headlights sweeping across the wooden fences that lined the property. In the back seat, Lily Bennett leaned against the window, her small face reflected in the glass. She clutched Rex's thick fur, as the German shepherd sat pressed against her side, his amber eyes flicking between her and the fields. Outside, as though he had already assumed full guardianship, Luke had chosen this destination with intent. He trusted few people, but Linda Owens had earned that trust long ago. Linda was in her late 60s, a sturdy woman of medium height, with a round face framed by short gray curls. Her complexion bore the deep tan of someone who had worked outdoors all her life, and her hands, rough and scarred, told of decades spent on farmland. Her brown eyes were sharp yet warm, carrying the weight of someone who had lost much, but refused to let grief harden her heart. She greeted them on the wide wooden porch with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, lantern lights spilling behind her. Luke, she said in a steady voice, her lips curving into a small smile that softened the lines on her face. "You don't bring people out here unless you need them safe." Luke gave a small nod. "This is Lily. She needs a place to rest for the night. Someone tried to bury her mother. Alive. Until we know who's behind it, she can't go home." Linda's eyes widened, her lips tightening, but she did not hesitate. She knelt slightly, reaching out a hand toward the girl. "You're safe here, honey. My farm's seen storms and worse. And it'll keep you safe too." Lily hesitated, then took the woman's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. Rex padded past them into the porch light, sniffing the air with alert curiosity. The farmhouse was old, but sturdy, its walls lined with shelves of preserved fruit jars and framed photographs of harvests past. A cast iron stove glowed in the corner, filling the room with warmth and the faint smell of burning cedar logs. Linda prepared hot cocoa and mismatched mugs, sliding one across the table to Lily. The girl wrapped her hands around it, absorbing both the warmth and the comfort it carried. Rex circled twice before, settling at the base of the stairs, his body angled so he could keep one eye on the front door and the other on the hallway leading to Lily's temporary bedroom. His ears twitched at every creak of the house. Luke knew his partner well. Rex was calm, but he was in protection mode. Later that night, when the farmhouse had grown still, the danger crept in. The hum of a truck engine drifted across the frozen fields. Its headlights were dimmed, crawling along the tree-in before cutting out entirely. The shape of an old pickup loomed in the shadows. Inside the farmhouse, Rex's ears snapped upright. A low growl vibrated through his chest, rumbling like distant thunder. Luke stirred from the chair where he had been, dozing lightly. He moved to the window, his broad frame outlined against the pale curtains. He saw it too, the outline of the truck parked where no neighbor would leave a vehicle at this hour. His jaw clenched. He reached for his sidearm, every movement deliberate. On the second floor, Lily stirred in her sleep. Her bedroom window rattled, faintly, as if touched. Rex was already moving, his growl deepened, and then he bolted forward, claws clattering against the hardwood floor, as he charged toward the porch. The moment the intruder's silhouette rose toward the side of the house, Rex exploded into the night, his body a streak of black and tan fur. He lunged with a snarl, the sound sharp and primal. The man cursed, stumbling back as the German shepherd collided with him, driving him to the snow. Luke was seconds behind, boots pounding across the porch. He yanked the man up by the collar, slamming him against the siding of the farmhouse. The intruder was in his mid-30 seconds, short and wiry, with a thin beard patching across a narrow jaw. His dark eyes darted wildly, his breath stinking of tobacco and adrenaline. The jacket was cheap, torn at the elbows, his gloves mismatched. He looked every inch the kind of desperate hired hand Caleb Morton would employ. A man with no loyalty but plenty of debts. "Who sent you?" Luke's voice was low but deadly steady. The man spat sideways, his lips twisting into a sneer. "I don't owe you." "Nothing." Rex snarled again, pressing closer, his teeth bared so near the man's arm that the intruder stiffened. Luke tightened his grip on the collar until the fabric bunched beneath his fist. "You were sneaking toward a child's window. Tell me who sent you, or Rex here will make you rethink your career choices." The man's bravado cracked. His eyes flicked to the ground, then back up. "Morton, Caleb sent me, said to scare the Rav. Kid, make sure she don't talk." Luke's stomach turned not at the answer, but at the confirmation. He shoved the man toward the porch rail, pulling a phone from the intruder's pocket. The screen lit up with a string of text messages, most of them coded with initials and numbers, but one name stood out in sharp clarity, repeated more than once. Silas Crow. Luke's eyes narrowed. He had heard whispers of that name in the darker corners of law enforcement circles. A shadowy figure rumored to handle falsified documents, insurance scams, and worse. But never had he expected the name to appear tied so directly to Cedar Falls. The intruder squirmed. "That's all. I know. I swear I'm just a messenger." Luke snapped cuffs around his wrists, his voice flat. "You're going to have plenty of time to think about that story downtown." Back inside, Lily had crept down the stairs, clutching the banister. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she looked from Luke to the cuffed intruder. Luke crouched, his expression softening. "You're safe, Lily," Rex made sure of. "That." Rex patted over, pressing his head gently against her side. Lily buried her face in his fur, her small shoulders trembling with both fear and relief. Linda Owens, standing in her robe, her silver hair lit by the glow of the lantern, pressed a hand to her chest. "Good Lord," she murmured, voice steady despite her shock. "Seems the storm's not outside. It's right here with us." Luke rose, phone still in his hand, the name Silas Crow glowing on the cracked screen. He looked out into the snowy darkness where the truck had idled and then disappeared. He knew then that Caleb and Kyle were pawns, nothing more. The real danger had just revealed its name, and it was coming for them. The storm rolled in before dusk, thick, flakes of snow tumbling across Cedar Falls, as if the heavens had decided to bury the town beneath a white shroud. By nightfall, the winds howled through the streets, rattling shutters and bending trees until they groaned. For Luke Matz, the storm was an ally. In weather like this, footsteps were muffled, engines hidden, and shadows blurred. If they were going to trap Caleb Morton and Kyle Mercer, there could be no better cover. The team gathered inside the police station's briefing room. Maps of the town and its outskirts were pinned to corkboards, red circles marking the target, the abandoned riverside sawmill. Once a thriving hub of timber work, it now stood as a hollowed skeleton of industry, its rusted saw blades and leaning sheds claimed by rot and snow. Detective Caroline Grant stood at the front of the table, her auburn hair tied back, her green eyes sharp and unyielding as she outlined the operation. "Caleb thinks he's meeting a courier tonight to finalize paperwork. We'll give him his courier, but it'll be us. The drop point is the sawmill floor. He's expecting cash and documents. We'll give him bait." Luke leaned back in his chair, his square jaw tightening, his gray eyes focused. And Kyle, Caroline's mouth curved slightly. He won't miss the chance to tag along. He's desperate and reckless. That makes him easier to flush out. Rex sat by the door, tail curled, neatly around his paws, his amber gaze fixed on Luke, as though absorbing every word. His ears twitched at the sound of the storm pressing against the windows, but his body remained coiled, ready. The convoy moved out just after midnight. The snow fell so thickly it seemed to erase the world outside the headlights. The SUV tires crunched across unplowed roads, each turn bringing them deeper into the skeletal remains of the lumber district. The sawmill emerged from the blizzard like a phantom, its wooden frame sagging, its roof half collapsed, the tall chimney leaning as though it had lost its will to stand. Icicles clung to every edge, catching the beams of the headlights like jagged spears. Luke cut the engine and listened. Only the wind moaned, carrying with it the faint groan of wood under the weight of snow. He motioned silently to Caroline and slipped out into the storm. Rex bounded after him, his paws sinking into drifts, but his movement sure, his nose pressed to the ground, sniffing for the scent of men. Caroline carried the bait, a battered envelope stuffed with blank forms and shredded paper, made to look like insurance documents and property deeds. She tucked it into her coat, her boots crunching over frozen gravel. Inside the sawmill, Caleb Morton stood hunched near a broken workbench, a flashlight clutched in one hand. His bulk was wrapped in a thick wool coat, but sweat still beaded along his forehead despite the cold. His thinning, blonde hair stuck to his scalp, and his watery eyes darted nervously toward every groan of the rafters. He looked like a man cracking beneath pressure. Beside him paced Kyle Mercer, restless as ever. His lean frame was hunched against the cold, his leather jacket offering little protection. His hazel eyes were sharp, darting toward the snow-choked windows. He rubbed his hands together, muttering curses under his breath. Unlike Caleb, Kyle thrived on adrenaline, but tonight his cocky edge was frayed by fear. "You sure this guy's coming?" Kyle demanded, his voice tight. Caleb glared at him, though his own voice quivered. "He'll come. Silas doesn't like loose ends." At the mention of the name, silence seemed to thicken in the sawmill. Even Kyle flinched. Silas Crow, a name spoken in whispers across shady bars and hushed phone calls, a fixer, a broker of schemes, the kind of man who never showed his face unless he had to. From the shadows near the rear, Luke crouched behind a pile of warped timber. Caroline lay low beside him, her breath misting in the freezing air. Rex pressed against Luke's leg, ears flat, eyes locked forward. The sound came first, Caleb fumbling open the envelope Caroline had planted on the bench. The paper crackled unnaturally loud in the cavernous silence of the mill. Luke's voice cut through the storm like a gunshot. "Put it down, Caleb." The flashlight jerked wildly. Caleb spun, eyes wide, face drained of color. Kyle swore, backing toward the nearest exit. Luke rose from the shadows, his tall frame broad against the faint glow of the storm behind him. His gun was drawn, steady, his gray eyes hard. Caroline flanked him, her own weapon raised, her gaze sharp as steel. Rex bounded forward, barking, his growl reverberating off the rusted walls. Caleb's knees seemed to buckle beneath his bulk. He dropped the envelope, raising his hands. Wait, I didn't plan this. I just took the job. Luke advanced slowly, voice low. Tell me about the job. Caleb's words tumbled out in a rush. It was Silas. Silas Crow? He came to me, said he'd pay if I expedited the process. I didn't know she was alive. I just signed what I was told to. Sign. I swear. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. You falsified a death to cash out insurance. Don't bother painting yourself as a bystander. Caleb's face twisted with shame, but he didn't resist as Luke cuffed him. His watery eyes darted toward Kyle, who was already making his move. Kyle bolted through a side door into the storm, his boots skidding across the snow-crusted planks. He sprinted into the lumberyard, weaving between stacks of old timber and rusted saw frames. The wind lashed against his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't look back. Rex did. The dog surged forward, muscles rippling under, his black and tan coat, paws pounding against the frozen ground. Luke and Caroline followed, but Rex cut the distance like a spear through the storm. Kyle's breath came ragged, each step less steady than the last. He darted across a stack of logs, glazed with ice, but his boots slipped. His arms flailed as he crashed down hard, snow exploding around him. Before he could scramble to his feet, Rex was on him. The German shepherd lunged, his weight slamming. Kyle back against the logs, his teeth clamped not on flesh, but on the thick leather cuff of Kyle's jacket, twisting until the man's wrist was pinned hard against the icy ground. Kyle cried out, thrashing, but Rex's growl was a thunderous warning. Stay down, Luke reached them seconds later, his boots digging into the snow as he pressed cuffs over Kyle's wrists. The younger man spat curses, his hazel eyes wild. You don't understand. This isn't just about me. Caroline loomed over him, her auburn hair whipping in the wind, her green eyes cold. Then start talking. Kyle's chest heaved, his lips pale. It's the money, insurance, property deeds. Silas set it up. Grace's house, her policy. It was all supposed to pass through me and Caleb. That's it. That's all I know. Luke stared at him for a long moment, then pulled him to his feet. The storm howled around them, burying the last of Kyle's words in its roar. But Luke had heard enough. Between Caleb's confession and Kyle's, the truth was clear. The fraud wasn't about grief or mistakes. It was about money, insurance payouts, a modest house on Cedar Avenue, and the hands pulling the strings belonged to Silas Crow. As the wind tore through the abandoned mill, Luke's grip tightened on Kyle's shoulder. Rex barked once, sharp and certain, as if to punctuate what everyone already knew. They had finally glimpsed the shape of the true enemy. The Yellowstone River cut a dark ribbon through the snowy landscape, its current sluggish beneath sheets of ice. Along its banks, warehouses sat like forgotten sentinels, their corrugated walls scarred with rust, roofs sagging under years of Montana winters. It was here in the abandoned freight depot by the water that Luke Mathers knew they would find Silas Crow. For weeks, the name had hung in the air like smoke spoken in whispers by those who feared him, written in coded messages on phones snatched from Caleb and Kyle. Silas wasn't the kind of man who left fingerprints. He left debts, broken promises, and people who vanished into silence. But tonight, following GPS coordinates planted in a funeral wreath and bank transfers traced through late-night work, Luke and Detective Caroline Grant had pinned him down. Inside the SUV, the heater blasted, fogging the windows. Luke leaned forward, his gray eyes fixed on the warehouse ahead. His jaw, roughened with stubble, flexed as he scanned for movement. Rex sat in the back, body tense, ears prick-ricked, amber eyes, glowing in the dark like twin lanterns. Caroline adjusted her bulletproof vest, her auburn hair pulled into a tight knot at the nape of her neck. He's in there. The accounts link back to this place. Transfers, forged deeds, even a list of beneficiaries. It all ends here. Luke nodded once, heavy and certain. Then tonight, it ends for him. Inside the warehouse, Silas Crow worked feverishly. He was a man in his late 42nd, tall but gaunt, his frame all sharp angles as if life had carved away everything unnecessary. His dark hair, streaked with gray, was slicked back, exposing a long, severe forehead. A jagged scar cut across his left cheekbone, a mark from a bar fight years ago that had earned him both a reputation and his silence. Silas never forgave, never forgot. His eyes were ice blue, piercing, and cold, and his mouth rarely curved into anything resembling a smile. Instead, it bent into smirks, calculated and dangerous. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a pressed shirt, a strange touch of elegance for a man surrounded by crime. On the steel table before him lay documents, insurance policies, falsified death certificates, property deeds. A shredder hummed at his side, chewing page after page into confetti. Silas's long fingers moved with meticulous speed, as though erasing evidence was an art form. Luke and Caroline approached from opposite sides of the building. The snowstorm muffled their steps, the only sound the low growl rising from Rex's throat. Luke raised a fist, signaling silence. A sudden clang echoed inside, the metallic snap of the shredder devouring another document. Silas cursed under his breath, shoving another stack into the machine. Luke kicked the door. It burst inward, slamming against the wall with a crack. Rex surged in, his bark booming in the cavernous space. Silas spun, his hand darting for a pistol lying on the table. His fingers brushed the grip, then froze as Rex lunged. The German Shepherd's snarl ripped through the air. He slammed into Silas, knocking him back against the shredder. The pistol skidded across the floor, spinning into the shadows. "Down!" Luke barked. Rex obeyed instantly, teeth snapping inches from Silas's wrist. The criminal froze, his icy blue eyes flicking between the officer and the dog, calculating but trapped. Caroline swept forward, weapon, trained, her voice cut sharp. "Silas Crow, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance, fraud, and forgery of medical documents." For the first time, Silas's mask cracked. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of fury. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Luke's jaw tightened. "We know enough." The warehouse soon filled with officers. Boxes were pried open, files stacked into evidence bags. Caroline flipped through one folder, her eyes narrowing as she scanned a list. "Luke, look at this." He leaned over her shoulder. The list was a grim roll call. Names, dates, addresses, each one tagged with notes like death, expedited, or pending funeral. At least half a dozen match families who had reported suspicious circumstances, loved ones buried under questionable conditions. Rex nosed another box, whining sharply. Luke pulled it open to reveal thick ledgers filled with payments, transfers from Kyle's account, notes signed by Caleb, and large sums rerouted to Silas. Every piece lined up, a chain from pawns to mastermind. Luke's chest grew heavy. They almost got away, with burying Grace alive. And how many others? Caroline's green eyes were hard, but her voice held a note of grief. Too many. At dawn, the courthouse in Cedar Falls buzzed like a hornet's nest. News had spread fast. An arrest, a scandal, a conspiracy so dark it had shaken the whole county. Reporters gathered on the steps, their voices rising with questions as officers escorted Caleb Morton, Kyle Mercer, and Silas Crow through the doors in chains. Caleb looked broken, his ruddy face slack, his watery eyes downcast. Kyle, wiry and twitching, muttered curses under his breath, his bravado gone, but his bitterness alive. Silas alone held himself upright, his icy stare scanning the crowd with contempt, as though daring anyone to challenge him. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harper, a stern man, with white hair and thick brows, presided with a gavel in hand. The charges read out were damning. Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, forgery of medical documents, each count laid heavier than the last. Luke sat quietly in the back row, his uniform crisp, Rex lying at his feet. Lily and Grace had not been brought in. This was no place for them. But Luke carried their presence in his mind. He knew every word spoken today mattered, not just for justice, but for their future. The prosecutor rose, voice steady. As she laid out the evidence, the forged documents, the insurance payouts, the ledgers tying Caleb and Kyle to Silas, and the near-fatal attempt on Grace Bennett's life. Each piece tightened the noose until even Silas's smirk could no longer hold. By the end of the day, the gavel struck 3 times, sealing their fate. The pale sun over Cedar Falls lingered longer now, as though spring had begun to press against the stubborn grip of winter. The snow still blanketed the rooftops and fields, but its edges were softening, melting into rivulets that ran down gutters and across gravel roads. Weeks had passed since the courtroom drama that had ended with Silas Crow, Caleb Morton, and Kyle Mercer shackled in chains. For Grace Bennett and her daughter Lily, time moved differently, measured not in trials or verdicts, but in heartbeats, hospital visits, and the fragile joy of simply being alive. At Cedar Falls General Hospital, the white halls smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender polish. Grace sat propped against her pillows, her chest rising slowly but firmly now, her complexion no longer gray, but warmed by returning strength. She was 36, with chestnut hair that had lost some of its luster during her ordeal, but now gleamed faintly in the sunlight, filtering through the blinds. Her skin, once pale and drawn, carried a new flush, a color born not of makeup, but of resilience. Beside her, Lily rarely let go of her hand. The little girl had changed too. Her blonde hair still tangled easily, her small frame still slight, but her blue eyes carried a depth that no child her age should have had to bear. Yet, there was also something luminous about them. Courage mixed with innocence, a reminder of the night she had dialed 911 when the world threatened to silence her mother. Community support had blossomed in unexpected ways. Cedar Falls was a modest town, but its people knew how to rally when tragedy knocked at their neighbor's door. A fund had been set up to ensure Grace and Lily could keep their home on Cedar Avenue. Donations came in envelopes slid under the police, backstation's front door in checks, mailed anonymously in jars, filled with coins left on counters of diners and hardware stores. One morning, Linda Owens appeared in Grace's hospital room, carrying a basket covered in a checkered cloth. Linda, sturdy and gray-haired, her face weathered by years on the farm, set it on the bedside table with a soft smile. "Apple pie," she announced, "fresh, from my oven. It won't heal bones, but it'll sweeten a day or two." Grace's eyes filled, her voice, but grateful. "Thank you, Linda. You've done so much already." Linda shook her head. "Nonsense. I didn't save you. That girl and that dog did. The rest of us, we just keep the fire burning." She winked at Lily, who flushed, and buried her face in her mother's arm. Rex, lying on the floor near the bed, lifted his head at the mention of dog. The 6-year-old German shepherd had become something of a local legend. His black and tan coat gleamed even in the hospital's dim light, and his calm amber eyes followed every movement Lily made. When visitors entered, their gazes always dropped to him, their voices softening in reverence. Children pressed drawings into his handler's hands. Rex, with a superhero cape. Rex with angel wings. Rex standing guard in the snow, to Cedar Falls. Rex wasn't just Luke Mathers's partner. He was their dog, the sentinel who had barked back at death. The day of the ceremony arrived under a sky stray with soft gold. The steps of 2. Cedar Falls's town hall were swept clear of snow, though the fields beyond still glittered white. Townspeople gathered, and in coats and scarves, their breath clouding the air, their chatter low but expectant. On the wooden dais set before in the hall, Luke Mathers stood tall in his pressed uniform, the navy fabric sharp against his broad shoulders. His square jaw was clean-shaven for the occasion, but his gray eyes carried the same gravity that had led him through blizzards, funerals, and midnight raids. By his side sat Rex, ears perked, his tail sweeping the board slowly, as if aware the crowd was waiting for him too. Detective Caroline Grant stood to the left, her auburn hair gleaming in the weak sunlight, her posture proud and unbending. She offered Luke a small nod, as if to remind him. This was more than a case closed, it was a beginning. Grace arrived in a wheelchair, still recovering, but strong enough to sit upright. She wore a simple wool coat, her hair pulled back, her face thinner than before, yet radiant. Lily walked beside her, clutching her hand. The little girl wore a borrowed white dress with a pink sash, the fabric fluttering in the cold wind. Her cheeks were rosy from the chill, her blue eyes luminous as she looked up at Luke and Rex. The mayor, a stout man with thinning hair and a booming voice named Harold Jenkins, stepped forward to address the crowd. Harold was known for his hearty laugh and his devotion to local history, often boring visitors with tales of Cedar Falls' founding. But today, his tone carried the solemnity of the moment. "We gather," he began, "to honor courage, where courage was least expected. From an 8-year-old girl who made a call that saved her mother's life, from a police officer who stood against corruption, and from a dog who reminded us all what loyalty means. The crowd murmured with approval, some clapping softly, others dabbing eyes. Luke stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. His voice was steady, carrying across the square. "Lily Bennett," Luke's voice carried over the hushed crowd, steady yet thick with emotion. "You showed the kind of bravery most grown men and women can only hope to find. When you could have stayed silent, you spoke. When fear pressed down, you acted. And because of that, your mother is alive. You reminded us of why we wear this badge." He opened the small velvet box. Inside, a silver badge gleamed, its polished surface catching the pale winter sun as though alive. Etched on its face were the words, "Honorary Junior Deputy." Luke crouched until his eyes met Lily's. "This belongs to you." Her hands trembled as she accepted it, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then, slowly, a shy smile broke through her fear. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound rolling across the snowy square like a wave of warmth in the cold air. Grace wept openly, pressing her hand against her mouth, unable to contain her gratitude. Rex barked once, sharp and joyous, his tail thumping the ground as if sealing the moment with his approval. As the ceremony ended, the sun dipped low, painting the fields in shades of amber and violet. Grace and Lily sat together on a wooden bench near the square, Rex stretched at their feet. Lily leaned close to her mother, whispering softly, "Mom," I called, and they came. Grace pulled her daughter into her arms, pressing her cheek against Lily's hair. "Yes, sweetheart, and because of you, we're here." The scent of apple pie drifted from Linda's basket nearby, mingling with the crisp evening air. The first stars blinked awake across the sky, scattering silver light over Cedar Falls. Luke stood a short distance away, one hand resting on Rex's head, watching in silence. He didn't need applause or medals. Seeing a mother and child alive, safe, and together, that was enough. But just as peace settled over the square, a low rumble broke the calm. A black sedan rolled slowly to a stop at the edge of town, its tinted windows catching the last shards of twilight. Luke's eyes narrowed. He knew that kind of car, it didn't belong here. The applause had faded, the crowd was gone, but something darker lingered in the air. Sometimes miracles arrive in trembling voices, in the bark of a loyal dog, in the courage of a child. But sometimes, they are only the beginning of another battle. And in Cedar Falls, as night swallowed the horizon, Luke understood one thing with chilling clarity. The scheme that nearly buried Grace alive wasn't finished.